Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to the fourth episode of the Inside Track. I'm Ashley Davies. I'm the EMEA Regional Lead for the Avid Learning Partner Program at Avid. Today, I am super thrilled to be joined by sound designer, supervising sound editor, and re-recording mixer, Steve Fanagan. Before we get started though, just want to quickly remind you how you can submit any questions you have for Steve. If you'd like to ask Steve a question during the session, then please submit via the Q&A function. There's a button at the bottom of your screen to submit, so please type it in there. We do also have some of the Avid team on the line, so if you have any Avid related questions, then I'm sure we can try our best to answer those too. If you have any questions for Steve, please send them in and we will try to cover them all in our Q&A at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, grab your cup of tea, grab some snacks, and then let's dive in. So we've got Steve here. Hello, Steve.
Hey, Ashley. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in. Looking forward to chatting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. First off, just thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're super, super busy, so it's very, very much appreciated. I'm sure everybody is very appreciative too. So should we dive in?
Let's do it.
So I thought, just to begin with, there may be some people on the line that, they might not be quite aware of what the role entails of being a sound designer and a re-recording mixer. So do you want to just start by giving us a little sort of background on what that involves?
Sure. This is always a really tricky question. It's a funny one because I think, so it's good, I think, for me to talk about it in terms of analogies with other film departments. And so I guess so I'll start by talking about sound designer and supervising sound editor, and then I'll talk a little bit about the mixing job as well. But I think from the point of view of supervising sound editor and sound designer, I mean, the analogy I find useful that I am totally stealing from someone else that I heard use it before was to think about it like production design or director of photography or costume design or hair and makeup, where essentially when a director is making a film, they're trying to make all these small choices in terms of how the film looks, what to include in the frame, how someone's hair looks, what they wear, where they live, the settings for any of the scenes that they might be building and thinking about with the rest of the crew, all hopefully tell us something story-wise, help us to understand what the film is, what it's about, when it's set, who our main characters are, maybe what their backgrounds are. Someone wearing a particular costume, someone's in sort of has messy hair and wet clothing. It maybe tells us something about that character before they've even said anything to us when we see them on screen. So I suppose with sound design and with sound editing, we're trying to do something similar with sound. We're trying to figure out what the world of the film should sound like to best express the director's intention and to best support the story and the narrative. And as the sound designer or the supervisor, you're the person who is probably from the sound department most in contact with the director on that. And you are sort of hopefully having good conversations with them through the process to try to help them figure out how to use sound and what to do with sound that best expresses story, character. And so that can be really simple stuff, like trying to figure out, the geography of the world the film's set in. And that could then dictate maybe, whether we hear particular bird calls or whether we, what the weather's like outside, or, if we're in a period set drama, obviously we're not going to hear cars, we're going to hear horse and cart, or we're going to, so there is all sorts of kind of decisions and ideas that in the early stages of the sound edit, we're trying to figure out that will help to inform the viewer on a subconscious level about the world of the film. And so that that's the main job of the supervisor and the sound designer, I suppose. But there's a couple other things that are definitely important in there as well. As a supervisor, you're generally working with a team of other sound editors. So you're also trying to communicate with them, make sure that they have what they need in terms of sounds, in terms of ideas, in terms of feedback as they're working on their aspect of the job. And that's probably you funneling notes that you're getting from your director and maybe their editor and maybe a creative producer who's involved in the process. And then the other thing is, like, you know, as a supervisor, you're also trying to manage time, trying to manage budget, trying to manage schedule, because all of these things have to happen according to whatever is available for that film. And so there's no point in sort of focusing all your work on 10 minutes of a 90-minute film and doing those 10 minutes really well. You have to figure out how to use the resources that you have to best create a soundtrack with your director for the film that you're making with them, that is achievable in the time and with the budget that you have. So there's a kind of a management aspect to it, from that point of view, but it's a creative collaboration with the rest of your team. And then I suppose the other aspect of sound design, and that term, I suppose there's sort of two ways to think about the sound designer. One is that in the context of a feature film or a TV series, they're the person who is sort of tasked with trying to figure out, in collaboration with the director, in attempting to interpret the director's vision or sonic vision for the piece, what sounds are appropriate, what sounds are useful, what sounds keep the feel and the expression of that world consistent and feel true to it. And then the other version of sound design and the other role that a sound designer can have is creating sounds from scratch, maybe things that don't exist. So the classic example is to think of someone like Ben Burtt in Star Wars, where you're sort of, you know, literally creating sounds for things that we do not have a version of in our reality. And so that's, so some sound designers, that might be their only job on a film, is to focus on creating those bespoke sounds that are unique to the world of the film, and then making sure that they, you know, are applied consistently across a film or a TV series. So that's sort of a rambling way of me answering what that role involves, or what those two roles involve, but they're quite broad. You know, a lot of a supervising sound editor's day can be spent talking to people and not just cutting sound. And that can be communicating with your director, communicating with their editor, their producers, your post-production supervisor, the rest of the team. And it can also be just about sitting in a dark room on your own, making sounds for the film. So, you know, there's lots of things that sort of fall under that banner, and they're all hugely important for if the work is going to be good and consistent and useful to filmmakers you're working with. And then I suppose the re-recording mixer part of the job is about taking all those sounds and all those ideas that have been worked on and thought about and developed in the sound editorial process, and trying to figure out how to bring them all together along with the score, to make the best, most creative, most honest version of the sound for the film that your director wants you to, or has been pushing for, and that I suppose you know that feels like it belongs in that film, and if it were any other way, it wouldn't feel natural or correct. And I think, you know, even when you think about fantasy, you know, films that have big explosions or big moments, we're still looking for a certain reality and a certain naturalness to that sound. We're still hoping that it's true to the world of the film, no matter how sort of fantastical that might be. And so the mixer sort of has that job, or mixers have that job in that process of trying to funnel all those ideas into something that is consistent and true to the world of the film.
And the two work very closely together, don't they? You know, if you're in a mixed theatre, and the sound designer will always sort of be present because, you know, they have their vision, the director has their vision, and the two, they all have to come together. And particularly, I think, in the final mix, that's when it all starts to really take shape. So it's a real collaboration, right?
Exactly, and I think it's a really good point. Like, so the mix generally breaks down into a process of pre-mixing, which is often the sound team and mixers maybe working in isolation, but trying to refine the sounds to a point where they're ready to present to a director to get input into that last creative push on the sound for the film in the final mix. And I think often as a supervisor or as the sound designer on the stage, you're sort of the go-between between the director and the mixers, because mixing can be they're very full-on days. And so, and the mixer generally just wants to be facing forward, looking at the screen, working through the tracks. And the director will be sat somewhere behind them, and somewhere either at the console or elsewhere in the theater will be the supervising sound editor and the sound designer. And I think when the mixer is working, often it's your job to gauge how the director's feeling about it, or to let the director know that it's still been worked on. Yeah, I know those feet are too loud right now, but he's just working on that line of ADR, or she's just working on that line of ADR. There's a sort of a in that collaborative, in the spirit of that collaboration, there is a kind of there's a great role to be had there, where you can create space and time for the mixer to work, and you can be sort of thinking about and talking about the bigger ideas with your director and whoever else might be part of that creative process at the time, and then feeding the mixer with those notes as and when they are able to hear them and take them in. So I think that collaboration is really important. And I think for me, if I'm also mixing on a job, which I do quite a bit of the time, I always make sure that I have someone on the stage with me who's a co-supervisor, so that information can be filtered to me if I'm totally distracted by what I'm doing mix-wise. If I'm, if you're trying to just work on sitting the footsteps into the world, or you're, whatever it might be, sometimes it's hard to hear a note. So to have someone there to communicate that to you and to remember the things that come up each time you do a pass through a scene can be really important. So it's a hugely collaborative job. And I think, like, I always I should have actually prefaced this by saying, anything that I talk about today, it's very much the work of a team. And anything that I've ever worked on, no matter what my job has been on it, I have been relying on the work of other people and the skills of other people to help us as a collective figure out what the film needs. And we're always doing that under the direction of our director, under their guidance. They're the one who knows the film better than anyone. And so it's always a collaboration. You're always helping someone to hopefully realize what they're hoping to with their film. And I guess the other key players that might be involved in that are their film editor or editors. And then there's generally, films tend to have a key creative producer or key creative producers. So there can be, on a mixed stage, there could be 2 re-recording mixers, a couple of supervisors, maybe a couple of editors, sound editors. You might have the film's editor, the director, and creative producers. So you could have, all those voices in the room trying to figure out how to eke the best version of the sound for the film out at any moment.
And could you just share with us a little bit about your typical workflow when you approach a new project? So with things like working with the director to make sure that you're aligned with their vision, building relationships with the production team, and just a little bit about spotting sheets. Is it something that you use? Do you use markers on the timeline? How do you look at it as a whole? And is it ever overwhelming?
Yeah, I think there's probably nothing more overwhelming than day one on a job when you're looking at an empty timeline and you're sort of going, this has worked out before, and I've a few credits to my name, and it's worked out okay. But I think that first day, and generally as you approach a new piece of work, there is a nervousness and an anxiety to it that is not a bad thing for the creativity. I think if I felt like I knew what I was doing from the get-go, as in I thought, I know what this film is, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and it'll be great, then I would be missing an opportunity to probably do something that is right for the film. It's easy to do something that's adequate. It's much harder to do something that's sort of tailored to and specific to the film that you're working on. And I suppose that's what you're always trying to work toward, is sort of, and I think it's being open to that idea of as you work on things, your first idea might not be your best, or your first idea might be a brilliant pathway to the best idea for the scene. And so for me, I like to work quickly, and I like to do my first pass quite quickly, because it means that I can kind of get an overview of what I think I need to go and record, or I can get an overview of things that I think are going to be tricky. I often start in what I think is going to be the hardest scene or sequence as my first thing, because I feel like I owe it to my director to get them something quickly for it. So I sort of say, okay, well, so to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned spotting, and so that process generally involves sitting down with the director and their editor and watching the film and stopping and starting and talking through scenes. And that process can take lots of different shapes depending on your relationship with the people that you're working with. So the first time you work with someone, it's going to be different than if you work with them a second, third, and fourth time. Mm-hmm. But it's generally about sort of, I really like for those sessions to be about us talking about sound as a feeling or an emotion or as a story point, rather than as I need a door there, or we need to do a car buy, or, you know, all of that stuff will become obvious as we work through it. But I think what's more interesting and more important is to talk about emotion and feeling, and trying to get an understanding, engage an appreciation for what the world of the film is, and then to figure out how best to use sound to express that, if that makes sense. And so you hopefully in that conversation that you're having at the spotting session, you're talking about those things. You'll hopefully have read a script in advance. You may, which I love to do, is have had a chance to actually watch the cut beforehand, so that it's percolated a little bit and you're familiar with it. And you'll talk about all sorts of things. You'll talk about parts of the sound. Maybe they're technically worried about whether you can hear the dialogue, or whether it's intelligible, or whether we'll need to re-record some lines in ADR, or whatever that might be. And we tend to talk about, I suppose, you try to talk about all the tiny details of what might be possible in the film. And sometimes it's great to get a sense of what a director really doesn't like, or really doesn't think is appropriate for the film that's happening, that for the world that they've created. It's often really good to know the stuff that they're just like, I want to avoid that. I don't want to do that thing. Let's try and find our version of X trope. Let's not use that trope. And so that can be really helpful, because you're sort of getting a sense of their taste. But then I think part of the journey then in the days and the weeks after that are sort of testing your understanding of that conversation you've had with them. So, you know, because sound is a very subjective thing. And I think we use language like we will say, oh, this scene should be warm, or this should be cold, or this should, you know, and those terms are very individual to each of us. So I'm really interested to send a director something quickly, or have them come in and listen to something with me quickly, where I go, I know we were talking about this being warm. Here's my take on that, but does this feel like your version of warm?
Yeah.
And by starting, what I find is, so there's two benefits that I find from it. One is if I'm going, look, I've done this really quick sketch, so don't get bogged down on it. If you hate it, that's totally cool. I'm just trying to figure out my way into it, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm understanding you. And so they don't, you know, I haven't gone and squirreled away for several weeks and I'm going, ta-da, this is brilliant, isn't it? I'm sort of going, what do you think of this? I'm trying to figure this out. Let's, you know, and it'll help us find our way to a common language and a common sense of feeling about what we're working on. And so I find that really useful. And I think those initial bits of feedback can really, you know, if you're way off on something or you're close to something, then at least you've got you've ruled some stuff out, you've ruled some stuff in. So your next pass, you'll kind of have a better gauge of what they're looking for. And also for me then, there's a brilliant experience of listening to the work with someone else. You almost hear it entirely differently when someone is sitting in the room and you're presenting your work. And so it's great to do that early in the process, because, you know, you can almost feel what someone's thinking as they watch it. And it's an amazing thing. I don't really know why that is, or how to describe it, or why suddenly you hear it differently, but it's an experience that lots of people talk about. So it's definitely common, I think, in this work. So I love to get to do that, because it really helps me get a perspective. You know, often when you're working on a sequence, you're really sort of looking at the minute detail, and you're really bogged down in that. And so to be able to zoom out, have someone else's perspective, and to sort of feel their perspective is really helpful. you know.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and then I think, like, in terms of I love using markers. A couple of my colleagues use a piece of software called Avid, which will create a little scene track for them from the script, and that basically, so you have in your Pro Tools session, you'll have a scene track, which is like region groups, and each of them it'll be whatever in the script the scene heading was, or the sequence heading was. So and I like to drop markers for that stuff because it helps me figure out where my boundaries are for if I'm cutting ambiences or I'm working on in and out points or time cuts. If I go and it also gives me an opportunity to go through the film quickly, just basically going, these are the cuts, these are the time transitions. It gives me a chance to sort of start thinking about the sounds I want to collect and the sounds I feel I have or don't have for something, or things I might need to make or create. So I find that process quite a meditative one, and a really useful one to just sort of, again, I suppose what you're trying to do in the first week is you're just trying to find your way in with the film. So anything you can do to familiarize yourself with it that doesn't just involve sitting and watching it, because there's sort of a part of the process that has to be about doing stuff. You can sit and watch something and have all the great ideas in the world, but until you start trying to execute those ideas, you have no idea if you're going to be able to. So I really love to chip away at it and try to get under the skin of it a little bit.
Yeah, and then you take it into the mixed theatre. You have a super session, and it's just a big long line of yellow. It's just all all markers.
Exactly, and you've seen my markers.
Yes.
You've experienced that. There are many, and like I love to drop them in for things. So I'll drop them in for really obvious stuff like scene changes or time cuts. But I also love to drop them in if I feel like, so say sound is generally perspective or subjective in a film. So there's usually a point of view, or you're trying to figure out a point of view for a scene or a sequence or a moment. And often that's about your main character or characters. And so you're trying to figure out, well, if our main character is Angela, what's Angela feeling at this moment? Because that will in some way tell us maybe what she's hearing or how she's hearing. And so you're looking for those clues as you watch through and drop your markers. And sometimes you see a blink, or you see a head turn, or you see someone drop their head, or you see them smile, whatever it might be. And you kind of realize, actually, there's something in that physicality, in that body language that invites us from a sound point of view to do something subjective from their point of view. So on a really basic, on a really simple level, like talking about my own work, if you something like Normal People, which like on the surface might feel like like a domestic show set in the modern day, and so the sounds are kind of real world, but there's lots of little ideas in there, lots of tiny details where you're trying to figure out where things would get really quiet, or where things would play larger than life. And if you think the sequence where Colin and Marianne kiss for the first time, the sound is this thing where it starts off quite normal, quite loud. There's a world outside Marianne's house, but as we sort of draw into them in this moment of intimacy, their footsteps get a little bit closer, their breath becomes a little bit bigger, the cloth movement becomes a little larger than life. And I suppose hopefully what that communicates to the audience is that we're in this intimacy now, we're in this moment with them. And the camera work, the way that show is shot, is putting us right in the space with them. So that kind of gives us an invitation with sound to do something similar. And at the same time, as you're pulling focus on those small sounds, you're pulling away some of the bigger sounds, like so the world outside disappears, or the sound of the clock in the hallway gets quieter. And I think by making those subjective decisions all the time with sound as we work through an episode or through a film, we're hopefully orientating the audience on a subconscious level. You don't want to do those things and have the audience go, oh, everything got really quiet. You want to do it over time, so it's felt rather than distracting. It's not something where, and I think that's, for me, that's what I really love about sound design and how subtle it can be. And it's sort of similar to how a director of photography makes a lens choice with the director, or how an editor chooses a shot and when to cut it. There's a feel and there's a rhythm, and there's a sort of an idea of a point of view that you're trying to find in the work. And I think from a sound point of view, you're always led by all that work that everyone's already done on the film. Because it gives you clues and gives you ideas and gives you hints about how the sound can be treated to hopefully underscore the work that they've already done.
Well, speaking of normal people, what would you say are sort of the main differences between working on a feature film and a TV series? Because you've you know, to point out one, you've worked on Radioactive, which was a feature film, but you've also done Normal People and series 1 of Game of Thrones. And you know, what's your perspective on the differences between those two different project types?
I think it's really interesting. I think like the main difference, obviously, like the most obvious difference is just the volume of material. So Normal People was 6 hours of television. Game of Thrones was 10 hours of television. Radioactive was 1 hour and 50 minutes. And so, and generally, you get to spend more time on a film than you would on a TV series, depending on how it's scheduled. But I suppose all of the same principles apply, and you're trying to figure out how to do all of the same things with your work. Sometimes you're doing it with less time in your schedule. So you're trying to figure out, like with Normal People, the director on Normal People and the main showrunner was Lenny Abramson, who's a film director that I've worked with a lot, and my colleague, co-supervisor, Noel Brady. We've worked a lot with Lenny over the years on film work. So this is our first time to work on a TV show together. And so you don't, like, we had this idea that we just didn't want to not work the way we're used to working, or to do the level of detail we're used to doing on the films with him, because we knew that we had a kind of, you know, it was the 5th time I had worked with Lenny, and I feel like we have a way of working, and it's something that we've enjoyed, and it's meant that he's come back and worked with me again. So you don't suddenly want to be rewriting the rules on that and saying, oh, we don't have time for that. You know, so you're trying to figure out a way to be consistent with what you're doing. I think, like, you know, the obvious thing with TV is that the story arc is bigger. It's over a longer period of time. So you have maybe more things to figure out over 6 hours than you do over 90 minutes or 2 hours. But it's about, you know, from a sound design and a supervising sound editor point of view, that idea that I was talking about earlier of trying to figure out what's appropriate for the show so that it's consistent, so that, you know, there's not something happening in episode 8 which makes no sense to the other episodes in the series. You know, it has to be something that's consistent. So on both a film and a TV show, the first thing that I do is I build a library of what I think we're going to need from an effects point of view. And we add to that the whole way through the show, because we go recording, or we find a cool library to buy, or we, you know, that's something that evolves and grows as we work on the show. And sometimes, like we were talking about earlier, the first idea you have for something is only the stepping stone to a better idea for that. So, you know, those ideas grow over time. And what's lovely about a TV show, and something like Normal People was actually the first TV show I had worked on since Game of Thrones, and I only worked on the first season of Game of Thrones. So it was like 10 years between the two, and all I had really done in between was feature work. So it was really interesting to get back into that world. We were working with a company that wasn't looking for us to do the work as quickly as possible. They were looking for us to do the work as well as possible. So we got a little bit more time than a show like that might ordinarily get. And that only ever happens if you have your director driving that, and you have the trust of your producers for that to happen. So, but I suppose, you know, there's just a lot more organization in a TV show over time. There's a point in the process where you're just mixing back to back. So you have to have a really great team that you're relying on to keep feeding you material, keep providing material. You have to, from my point of view, I need to figure out a way that I'm going to listen to everyone's work before it gets to the stage. And on episodic, that's a little trickier to manage your time on, because there is just that point in the process where you're mixing back to back. And I don't like to ever go to the stage with material I haven't heard and played with in some way myself, because I feel like I owe it to my director to know what's there, but also to kind of have felt out whether I think it should be there or not. And again, over my experience in a series, you know, you you have this sort of memory of what you did in episodes 1 to 3. So when you hit 4, you want to make sure that whatever's going on is consistent with the world, even if, like in the case of Normal People, you move from rural Sligo to the city centre in Dublin. There still is a consistency that has to be in there. And so I think, like, I've really enjoyed working on both. I've worked on I've worked on several features in between, and now I'm on a TV series again. And so you just feel like, you know, it's the same thing. I heard someone describe the work as a kind of, you know, when you're working on a film in sound, it's a marathon. So it's, you know, it's a good analogy in that you don't want to sprint week 1, because you've got to figure out how to make sure that you're using your energy so that in 6 months' time, when you're at the last stages of it, you're still going to feel as excited and energetic about it as you did in week 1. And so that, I think, it's, you know, trying to be sensible about how you conduct your days, trying to, you know, from my point of view, it's always about hiring the right crew, making sure they're people who I feel like I have a good sensibility match with. You know, you want to make sure that, like, it's like the same if you're gonna put a band together. You know, if your band does a particular thing, you want to make sure that the bass player is in tune with that, or the drummer that you know, it's just that idea. There has to be a sort of an aesthetic and a sensibility, and more importantly than anything, I think a bunch of personalities that you feel you can collaborate with and rely on. So I think there's lots of differences in terms of, like, with a film, you're building towards one mix, or maybe you're building towards a couple of temp mixes for preview screenings, but ultimately toward one mix of this one block. Whereas with a TV show, you might have a couple of directors. There's going to be periods of editorial and then mixing, and editorial and then mixing. And so it's just a little bit of a different headspace. There's probably more voices in a room on a TV show as well, because there's always broadcasters and other people who have valuable input. So there's lots of other people to communicate with in a really good way. And you know, it's a slightly different headspace, but I can only really approach the work in one way, which is to sort of try to feel out what I think my director is looking for from us, and to hopefully work closely with them to help them find it and for us to figure it out. So, you know, they're different beasts in some ways, but it's funny, like, you never approach the work on 2 films the same way. Even if you're working with the same director a second or third time, each piece of work is sort of its own thing, and ultimately it'll reveal itself to you in the process. And so I think it's important that you approach every job with an open mind. And I think the only thing, exactly, because once you start, I really feel like if you start assuming you kind of have this one in the bag, you're just not going to do your best work. And I think that's what I'm interested in. And I love when I'm sort of uncertain about something, or when when you're working on something, you're kind of not sure what it is. You're not sure what it should be. It's up to you to go on that sort of exploratory journey, listen to the notes that have been fed back to you, and to find what's appropriate and original and unique for this unique piece. You know, someone has had a unique idea and they've written a script, or they've adapted a script, and then a director has taken that and they've figured out their vision for it, and they've shot it in a particular way, and then it comes to the picture edit and they're figuring out what the film is in another way then. And so we as sound practitioners just owe it to the filmmaking process, and we owe it to our director to be open to that, and to sort of, you know, there's no bad notes. There's some notes that you mightn't understand. There's some notes that you mightn't instinctively agree with, but it's up to you to figure out how to process them and how to work through them. Sometimes a note about a specific is actually not essentially about that thing. Sometimes it can be about something 20 minutes earlier in the film that just isn't making that make sense. So,
notes can change, right? So one minute it's, oh, can we turn that down a little bit, and then the next, oh no, put it back where it was.
Absolutely. And I think that idea, I think that's a really good example, because I think what often happens is sometimes you have to show the director or show the person giving you the note something in its opposite for them to go, no, actually, I think where it was right. Mm-hmm. But I just wasn't sure. And now that I've seen that other version of it, I get it. Yeah, and I think that that's really important. And sometimes it can be like a little bit mind melting, because you're under time pressure and you're in the throes of something, and to suddenly go, well, okay, yeah, we can do that the opposite way. And then to have to go back. But I just don't ever resist that stuff, because I think it's really valuable. Sometimes when you do that flip or you do that change, it's perfect. Mm. And sometimes, and in that other example, if the one that you gave, where if it actually allows someone to see, no, actually the way we had it was great, that's really valuable, right?
It is. Yeah, absolutely.
It's all part of the journey of it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we get a little bit techie? Can you tell us what tools you rely on in order to do your best work? So things like, do you use Pro Tools? Is there any plugins that you favor, hardware, microphones that you use when you're out and about recording?
Yeah, loads of stuff. Well, Pro Tools is the thing that I use, and I think it's probably important to say, and this is not because this is an Avid conversation. This is what I would be saying on anything, is that Pro Tools is kind of the standard for this work. And I think, it's something that I use every day and I never think about,
like riding a bike.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like, if you want to write, you got to learn how to use a pen, or you got to learn how to use a typewriter. For film sound, Pro Tools is sort of, it's the most universal tool that I've seen used. It's and it's really important to think about this in terms of how films get made and how soundtracks get made. And often, there's a team of sound editors, so we all need to be on the same platform if our work is going to feed into each other. That needs to be the same platform as we're mixing it. Mm-hmm. We all use other software, but ultimately it comes back to Pro Tools at some point. Yeah. And when we're recording Foley, or we're recording ADR, or we're getting delivery from music editor or composer, Pro Tools is the thing that we all use that allows us all sync up. And so it's just one of those things that I see as essential. It's not the first DAW that I learned. I was saying this to you the other day. I used Cubase and I used Cakewalk, which this is like going back to the 90s. Mm-hmm. But those were the first software that I ever used. And I think that learning any DAW is valuable, but having Pro Tools knowledge is really essential for the film sound work I've been involved in. And so, we were talking earlier about the fact that there is a free version of Pro Tools. So if you're working in another DAW and you sort of have a preferred way of working, I would still encourage anyone watching to familiarize themselves with Pro Tools. And Pro Tools First is a good way to do that, because it's free. And then to see how it suits you from there. But it is just about having the right tool for the type of work you want to do. Absolutely. And then, my other absolute, always open, always working piece of software is SoundMiner. And that's basically like a piece of database software that allows me scan my effects libraries, so I can search them by search term, just like a Google search bar. So if I'm looking for a particular model of car at a particular speed, doing a particular move, I can hopefully find that by doing the right search. And SoundMiner will then allow me audition files, select the section that I want, and allow me to spot it into Pro Tools. So I find that, and it has incredible sort of manipulation tools. I love its pitch shifting, but it has this whole new thing in it called Radium, which is sort of like a synclavier, but like in the modern era, it's this really powerful sound manipulation tool.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. It's one of those things you could lose many, many, many days of your life on alcohol with it, but the results are phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's a piece of software I love. There's an alternative called Basehead, and there's an alternative called Soundly. I know that Pro Sound Effects has their own version as well, which I can't think of the name of. But there are other examples. It's not the only one, but it's the one that I've used. I sort of started to use it about, I don't know, 13 or 14 years ago, and I haven't stopped. Plugin wise, you know, it always changes over time, but I have my faves. You know, I love the FabFilter stuff. I love the pro stuff and Pro Tools, like the Pro Limiter. I really like. I like the compressor. But I'm a real, you know, for me, the most important tool that we have is our ability to listen. I know it sounds really corny, you know, but actually, I think it's really important not to get bogged down in gear. It's really important to respect gear. It's really important to have things that you like, things that you need, but you don't need to have all of the gear. And all we have to do is look at film history or look at music history to look for examples of how brilliant things were made very simply. And they were made because people knew what they were doing and they were listening. So I think, you know, the most important thing is to have an appetite to listen, to have an appetite to develop a taste and a flavor for sound. And I think this is true of any sound discipline you might be involved in, whether it's music or radio or film or whatever it might be. But just that idea that that you're constantly listening, you're constantly trying to tune your ears into things. You're sort of out looking for sounds that you think are interesting. You're trying to figure out how, you know, if you watch a film and you really like it, chances are the sound was good. So go back and watch it again, try to figure out what was good about the sound, figure out what they were doing. And I think that that's invaluable. And so I think that listening thing is really important. When I go out and record, I have a few different recorders. The main one I use these days is just a sound devices Mix Pre 3, the newer version of it. But it's quite a small compact recorder, which I quite like because I generally am out recording real world sounds. So I like to be as discreet as I can be. You know, I think anyone who's ever been out in the street with a microphone will have had the experience of people shouting into it, or or like beeping their horn or whatever it might be. There's sort of there can be a little bit of a kind of a chaos magnet. So I went to this workshop years ago by a wildlife recordist called Chris Watson, who works a lot with the BBC wildlife team. So he's done a lot of the sound recording for the David Attenborough series over the years. And he swore by lav mics out in the field. So I use a couple of DPA 4060s. There's some cool companies that do, you know, more affordable versions of them, but just like small lavs. So they're omnidirectional, space them apart. His trick was just having a coat hanger, clip the two of them onto the coat hanger, and you can hang that onto something. So his example at the time was just hanging it on the leaf of a tree because it's really light. Yeah. And then, you know, it's a really easy, compact thing to carry around. If you're sort of out in public, you can also just clip those mics onto yourself. Yeah. So it's not obvious. So if you're like, you know, if you're out trying to record some traffic or a bus by or something, no one is sort of getting distracted by what you're doing and hence approaching you and getting in the way of you getting that sound. So I find that a really useful way to record. It keeps it quite discreet. But there's all sorts of cool recorders, like affordable recorders, like, you know, all the Zoom line. Sony has all sorts of everyone has a version. And I think when I think about sort of starting out in this work maybe 14 years ago, even then those options weren't really there at the quality that they're at now. So it's really exciting how, you know, there's a great thing that's happening all the time where people crowdsource libraries. So a bunch of different recordists in different places will go and try and record the same sound to build a library together and share it. And like those recordings come from all sorts of different recorders. And it's just actually about someone listening to make sure they put the mic in the right place. And so I'm very unsnobby about that stuff. I sort of I think the best recorder is the one you have.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the thing you're going to get your best sounds with. So, so I think, it's really, there's a sort of the way the technology works now, we have affordable options and all of these things that we can record really good stuff on. So again, listening is so important. It's like, so when I go out and record, I don't set the recorder up and walk away. I'm always with it with the headphones to hear what I'm recording, to make sure the mic's in the right place, but also to, if you're out and about trying to record an ambience, something really great can happen. And like, I don't know, a bird flies overhead and you hear something you've never heard before. And the only way you're going to remember that, and the only way you're going to know where it is in your library, is if you've been listening at the time and it's sort of imprinted. So I think that's really important. So yeah, like I'm not a gear junkie, but I do have lots of stuff that I use, every day. My monitoring is all Genelec, but I've built that up over time. And I think hopefully, as your career develops, each job allows you buy or replace equipment or upgrade equipment. So it's something that I'm always doing. It's sort of similar to, I think everything about sound work is sort of a constant learning and a constant evolving. And so it's the same with equipment. You just because you're using one set of tools on one film doesn't mean you should use them on the next. You sort of, I'm always trying to figure out what's appropriate for the next project. So can I afford to, will I buy that this time? You only have to buy Altiverb once, or you only have to buy you have your subscription or whatever you have, and you sort of build on that over time. So so I think it's important. But I think, when the first recording machine device that I had was a 4-track tape machine, and it, 4 faders, a couple of EQ pots, and a cassette tape. And so, you can make something with that, and some great records. How many Beatles records were made on 4 tracks? Exactly. So, it's like, you just use the tools you have, make stuff make something that resonates with you. I think I'm always trying to see if I feel something about what I'm working on, if I can, if I'm piecing something together, does it affect me? Because if it doesn't affect me, then how can I expect it to affect my director and for them to then present it to an audience and have it affect them? So it's always about expression rather than gear, but it's good to build up things over time and keep interested, keep hungry to find new things to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you just tell us a bit about what inspired you to work in the audio post-production industry? Can you give us some background on like how you got to where you are today? You're based in Dublin, right? And from previous conversations we've had, you mentioned that you were actually started out on the musical side. So if you could tell us a bit about that, that would be really, really useful.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things that's really obvious probably to anyone is that there's no straight path into film work. Just like there's no straight path into music work. It's sort of, when you work in the arts, you work in the creative industries, there's no door you go and knock on and walk in and get a career. There's just, it's always everyone's gonna have a slightly different journey. Everyone's journey is gonna be slightly meandering. There's never just a straight line. And I think that's okay. I feel like if I hadn't done all the stuff that I did before I started to do the film work, then I probably wouldn't have been able to do the film work that I did. So I kind of realized at some point in my teens that I really liked sound and I really liked music. Like, I mean, who doesn't like music? But I was really interested in the mechanics of music. I was really interested in how things were written and how things were produced and put together. And I think so from starting playing in bands, and then like in my mid-teens, say, I sort of, by doing that, then how do we record this stuff? How do we demo this stuff? What do we do? And this was before computers were able to do this stuff easily. And so, so the tape 4-track or whatever, the first digital 4-track, I think I used some point in the late 90s, and then computers maybe came in the early 2000s or around 1990,000, something like that. But so from playing in bands and knowing musicians and recording some stuff and working on some stuff, then people begin to go, oh, you recorded and mixed that. Do you want to do my record? And you sort of I guess fall into it's the wrong word, because I was interested in that. But that's how the journey sort of begins with it. And at the same time, I studied communications in Dublin City University, which is kind of like a broad media course where you do some video stuff, you do radio, you do photography. I really loved photography, and that's what I specialized in. But I had a love for radio as well. But I had this great photography teacher who was this amazing artist, Carl Grimes. And he was really encouraging of both the sound and film work that I was interested in, and myself. And one of our classmates for our thesis ended up making short films, and I did the music. And so, these little things sort of were pointing in the direction of where I finally ended up. But it wasn't until I was about 30 that I met a Foley artist called Doyle, who's an Irish Foley artist who I've done the majority of my work with since. And she had just come back from Canada, where she had been working and training for years with a guy called Andy Malcolm. And they were just after building the first Foley stage in Ireland in Ardmore Sound. And so I was like, you do what for a living? Like, what? Like, I don't understand this. You walk people's footsteps, like the footsteps I hear in a film. What is this? So I was so fascinated by it. Like, and I saw her do a workshop, and I saw her create sounds live against picture. And I just thought, this is insane. Like, this is so brilliant. I love this. Yeah. And like, even though I was sitting watching her make the sound, when it played back with the picture, I forgot about how she made it, and I just believed it was in the picture.
Yeah.
And so I kind of thought, this is amazing. This is like, from my point of view with music, I had gotten more and more into experimental stuff, and I'd gotten more and more into not songwriting, but sounds, and the idea of just sort of meditative feeling, sort of ambient music. And so seeing her work as a Foley artist, and then going out and watching her work at the studio and getting a sense of that, and then meeting some mixers and designers and realizing, hold on a minute, there's this whole world where you can marry sound and picture, the two things that I've always been interested in. But also you're sort of collaborating all of the time, which I was very interested in, because with music I had sort of ended up naturally gravitating towards working with other people on their music. And so there was kind of there was just a confluence of things that came together in that moment. And I remember walking into the mix theater at Ardmore Sound the first time and seeing this giant Harrison console that was set up for two mixers and cinema screen. And the room is like, it's a big mix room there. It's sort of like proper cinema size. I just been like, oh my gosh, this is actually a thing. This is a job you can do. And and then just realizing, actually, you know what, this is so sort of, it pulls together all of the things I'm interested in. I have to give this a shot. So like I said, I was 30. So it was sort of, I had a career, and I kind of went, actually, I'm going to try and do this. So I sort of had to start at the bottom again and figure my way into it. But I just saw something in it that felt like it was a natural fit. And I think I was at a point where I knew that if I took it seriously enough, I could give it a decent stab. And if it didn't work out, well, at least I knew I tried to do the thing that I thought I would be interested in. And so, sorry, this is a long-winded, rambling answer, but probably all my answers are. But I essentially ended up then with my first job in a film as a music editor, which sort of perfectly led from the music work that I've been doing for years and the radio work I've been doing for years. And from that, then I became a dialogue assistant to a supervisor for a job. And on that job, she was kind enough to let me cut some dialogue. And so then just over time, through assisting people or becoming an effects editor for a sound designer, whatever it might have been, just started to build up my experience. And, I was lucky enough that I worked with supervisors and mixers who gave me some pretty blunt and pretty constructive feedback. And sometimes that feedback was, this is great. Sometimes it was like, this is not right, And I think I owe them a lot for that honesty, and for that kind of, that feedback so important to helping you refine your craft and develop your craft and refine your ear and figure it out, you know. So again, I feel very fortunate for the people I've met along the way. I mean, if Quiva hadn't opened that door for me and let me just come and sit with her while she worked and then let me assist her for a few months, I wouldn't have discovered this. And then the same is true of the supervisors I've worked with and the mixers I've worked with, who were sort of just really, who were patient and generous. And I think the thing that I've always noticed with this business is that if someone gives you an opportunity, they will give you another one as long as they feel like you've learned something from that previous job, and that your ego didn't get in the way of the hard stuff, and that you didn't get carried away with the stuff you got praised for as well. You know, there kind of has to be there's a measure to it, I think, and you sort of, it's great when something works, brilliant, but then there's these 10 things that didn't work, so be better at those. And I think that's sort of something that's sort of ongoing. I think for anyone who does this over a long period, you're always learning and developing. So I think if I hadn't worked and collaborated with musicians, or I hadn't worked at radio stations and collaborated with other people on shows, I wouldn't have learned some of that interpersonal stuff that's really important to the film work. Because, you know, like if you're sitting on a mix stage, whatever your role is, there's going to be good points and bad points in a day to give someone notes, or to express your opinion. And then how you express that opinion or how you offer that note is really, you know, it's a really important thing. And I think learning those skills of communication and collaboration are probably more valuable than anything. And I think we all learn those in all aspects of our life. You know, we learn them from every job we work. We learn them from school or from university or college or whatever we're doing. We have to figure out how to communicate with each other in a constructive way. We have to figure out how to read a room. You know, there's times where you might have something perfectly valid to say, but it's just totally the wrong time for you to say it. You know, so pick the moment, you know. And what I often do with directors I work with, you get into a rhythm where you realize they're much happier to talk to me at 9 a.m. or at 3 p.m. But outside of that, I just leave them alone because they're in the edit, or they're working with the composer or whatever it might be. And you just, you know, you figure those things out over time. So I think like it's kind of a long-winded way of saying to anyone listening, whatever you're doing is going to be valid for this work. Because you're trying to learn a craft that takes time. You never stop learning. And part of that as well is figuring out how to interact with people and how to communicate with people. So, you know, and I think with sound and film, you're always working for someone. It's never just your work. Your work is involved in it, but it's someone else's film. And so you have to have that wherewithal to understand that. And you also have to have that sort of desire to collaborate rather than just do the thing you think is cool or just do the thing you think is right. It's like, no, hold on a second here. There's someone whose opinion is actually much more important than mine in the situation.
Yeah, a big one that I learned was, is just customer service skills. And I'd previously worked as a waitress, and I didn't quite realize just how transferable those skills are and how they work in that particular kind of environment. And I think that's, you know, for anybody listening who's maybe a student looking to get into the industry, and take those skills and utilize them, because, you know, when you're in a mixed stage, it's as you say, you need to be able to read a room. So that's really, really important. Absolutely.
And I think there's no difference. It's all human interaction, right? And it's all trying to read someone, and it's trying to figure, you know, we all say things, but what we mean when we say them is something quite different, right? How we say them, how you read someone's body language, there's just some moments in life where you realize, if I speak now, it's going to be bad. So I'm going to stay quiet, but I'll pick my moment. You know, I'm not going to not say what I think because someone is hiring me to have an opinion on stuff. But there's just sometimes there's a good opportunity to offer that opinion, and sometimes it's not. And I think gauging that and being sensitive to that's really important. And I think that's why in this industry it's so important to have people from all walks of life, because everyone's personal experience is what makes them a unique creative, and what makes them a unique collaborator, and what makes them a unique communicator. And that, all of that, you know, the more ideas and the more differences in a room, the more unique the project you collaborate on and create is going to be. And so being open to that and being excited about that feels really important to me. And I think, you know, there's also that thing of, I think we all have to always remember that everyone involved in the process with us, whether that's whoever's on the stage with us, no one is more important. You know, you may get to voice your opinion more than someone else because of your job description, but actually, if you get a note from someone, it's really important to hear it and listen to it and think about it, because someone else's perspective could just be a revelation that you need to make the work good. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time, so I'll go through a couple more questions and then we'll jump to the Q&A